All right, folks, what's DBScan? Who can explain?
Density,
Yes.
density-based clustering. So DBScan use density clustering in the sense that it looks for like data points that are closer to like each other, and then attach them to like the cluster. Then if it is far away from there, it's push it to the next cluster or try to find the middle in between them.
Okay. No, not the median and the stuff. You are kind of confusing between k-means and DBScan at this point, right?
Okay.
Not the median. So there are two parameters. So for k-means, that later part, like the centroid, what you're trying to talk about, that's from the k-means, right? So you take random points to start off with, right? That you assume as to be centroids of each of the clusters you're trying to build. So each cluster in iteration 1 will have 1 point each, which is the centroid or the random points that are picked and which are assigned as centroids of the clusters. And they'll be labeled with the cluster labels, right? K cluster labels. Now, each new point that you get, you will check how far it is from all the centroids that are there, the K different centroids, and you'll see which it is closest to. And you'll attach it to that particular cluster, right? And then you will recalculate the centroid. That's k-means. DBScan has two other parameters. It doesn't have k, it has epsilon and minimum points. Those are the two parameters, right? So let me quickly share my screen, and you guys should remember this figure that we spoke about last time, right? Two parameters, epsilon, which is the radius of the circle that you would like to draw, and n, or some kind of variable, which is the minimum number of neighbors that a point is supposed to have, right? And you guys remember the three different types of points that the model detects: a core point, a border point, and a noise point, right? So in every point of your data set, right, the model, the DBScan model, and by the way, DBScan's full expansion is density-based spatial clustering of applications with noise. Okay, you're not expected to know this, but it's good to know if somebody asks you in the interview, hey, can you tell me what DBScan stands for? You remember in the last class, I told you guys it's an acronym, right? It's density-based spatial clustering of applications with noise, right? So if you see, it's a kind of intuitive because this is one of the few clustering models which detects noise and which doesn't cluster the noise, right? If you remember last class, we discussed this as well, that k-means comes to a stop when the model has attached a label to every point in your data set, which means there is no point that is left out. Every point needs to have one of the k labels. If it's 3 clusters, then you'll have 3 labels. You'll have one of the 3 labels, right? If it's 4 clusters, k equals to 4, you will have 4 different labels. And every point will have one of these 4 labels, and every point will be labeled. And once every point is labeled by the model, that's when the algorithm stops, right? So here, with respect to DBScan, it doesn't have the requirement or the need to cluster every point. So some points will be left unlabeled, and those unlabeled points are what are kind of labeled unofficially as noise, right? So that don't belong to any specific group that can be seen in the data set. Okay. Now, if you see here, right, like these are the 2 parameters as we discussed: epsilon, the radius, and n, the minimum number of neighbors that a point needs to have. So for every point, you draw a circle around that point. With the point as a center, you draw a circle around that point, and that circle, the radius of that circle is epsilon. That's what you define to the model, right? So you assign a specific radius value, say 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever it is, right? So if it's 1, you see a circle with 1 unit radius. If it's 2, you see a slightly bigger circle. 3, an even bigger circle, right? So like that, the smaller or larger circle is drawn based on the value of radius that you prescribe, right? And based on that circle, right, what you what the model basically tries to understand is, once it draws the circle, how many points, other data points, actually fall within this circle, fall inside this circle, right? So if there are certain number of points, say k number of, or a number of points, let's say a number of points inside a circle, it tries to compare the number of points inside the circle for a specific point to the n, or the minimum number of neighbors that we have also defined. That's the other value we will define. So if that a value, the number of neighbors of this specific point, right, if it is equal to or greater than my minimum number of points, let's say if I require minimum 10 neighbors, right, for a specific point, and if the point that I am looking at right now has only 5 neighbors within the circle, right, then I would say 5 is less than 10, which means that it is not satisfying this criteria. So it is not core to my cluster, right? Or it is not a core point to the way I am defining, or to the way I want to define my cluster. Okay, so that won't become the core point. It could become the border point if this point, which has 5 neighbors, in itself, this point in itself is a neighbor to another point which has 10 neighbors around it in the epsilon radius circle, right? In that circle, if this is one of the neighbors, then it becomes a border point. And then there is a third condition where you draw the epsilon circle around the point. Neither does it have the minimum number of neighbors required, nor is it a neighbor of a point which is a core point in the cluster, in which case that becomes noise, right? So these are the 3 ways the points are classified by the, or rather identified by the clustering algorithm. And once these points are identified, what happens? The core points and the border points together make the cluster, right? And they get labeled, and the noise which is outside of these points is basically unlabeled and left out, right? That is not supposed to be considered. That's just anomalies in the observations. That's what this is. So, and that's what DB scan means, and that's how it works, right? Okay. All right. Now I drew a circle over here, right? And let's say this epsilon here is equals to 2, right? Which means the radius of this circle is 2. Okay. Let's assume that aspect. Now, what I will do is, I'm assuming that that's the point that I want to look at. And this is my circle, okay, of radius epsilon. Now, my minimum points, neighbor, I am defining it as 6, okay. Now, do I call this point as a core point or not? What type of a point is this? So this yellow point that I marked, is it a core point? Is it a border point? Or is it a noise? Okay.
It's a core point, I think.
So who wants to answer? Liz, you are answering?
I said core point.
Why?
Because it's kind of in the middle of the epsilon circle.
Okay, no, that's not the reason. Can anybody answer why it's a core point?
So I'm right on the first one, right?
No, yes, it is a core point, but why is it a core point?
Because it's inside the circle.
No.
Any of the points that are, I think, on the line are the border points.
No.
No.
Okay, so here's what I will tell you guys. Okay, I don't think you guys understood the concept.
But core means core.
Like when you specified your parameters, like wasn't it one of the core points, and you said the epsilon was like 3?
2.
So if it's within,
So
like,
epsilon was 2. Yeah, epsilon is 2. Okay.
2. Okay.
So which is the radius of my circle, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Epsilon is 2. What's the minimum points? It's the minimum number of neighbors, right?
6.
Correct. Right. Now, can you tell me if this is my yellow point, right? That's the point that I'm looking at. How many neighbors does it have inside the circle?
Oh,
7.
6.
8.
6 neighbors. 6.5.
Count again.
7.
Plus Is it the first one or this new one?
No, the new one is just a circle that I drew.
Okay.
This is my data,
No.
right? These.
Are we counting the yellow thing as a neighbor? No, right?
No, that's the point I'm talking about.
Seven.
What are the other points inside the circle?
Seven.
Then, and that
Yeah,
inside the
for
circle will be the minimum, because
red
if
circle.
you want inside the circle, it has the minimum.
See, the circle's radius
No?
itself
Okay.
is 2, which is here. Okay. The circle's radius is 2. Forget about the size of the circle. Minimum points is 6. Okay. How many points are there? Jude, you were saying 7?
Yes.
Yeah. So can you guys count 7 points inside the circle? Everyone?
8.
Yeah, 7, 7.5. Like, yeah, it's on the border. Maybe you can consider it, right? Maybe 8, right? Because it's a big point. It's a big thing that I drew. It kind of looks 7 or 8, right? Roughly. Now, is 7 or 8 equal or greater than 6? It is, right?
Yep.
Now, does that satisfy my number of neighbors condition?
Yep. Because you said minimum of 6.
Exactly. So what does that become? That becomes the core point, right? Now,
Core point?
yeah. So it is. That's why it is a core point. You get the
Okay.
idea now.
Yeah.
So you label a specific point as core point if you draw the circle, right? Like you are drawing. We are putting the circle around that point, right? And we are saying that, okay, how many neighbors does it have inside this sized circle? A 2 unit sized circle. Let's assume that the size of the circle is 2, right? The radius is 2, but let's assume the size of the circle is 2, right? If the size of the circle is 2, with a 2-sized circle, how many neighbors does it have? Does it have 6 or more? It does have more than 6, and that's why it's a core point. Now, so this circle is kind of very similar in size, right? Okay, so again, this is a 2-point circle, right? Look, now let me put it here, okay? How many points do you see inside the circle?
You mean inside the intersection or which circle are you referring to?
No. Inside the
4.
circle
The new one.
that I'm moving right now.
5.
4.
4?
5.
Yeah.
Yeah, 4 or 5. Nonetheless, 4 or 5, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the minimum points?
It
The
will be-
minimum is 6. It doesn't meet the
6.
minimum.
Mhm.
Exactly. So when it doesn't meet the minimum, is it a core point or a border point?
Border
It's
point.
not the core point because it doesn't meet the minimum.
Correct. So it's a border point, right?
Mhm.
The next best thing, the border point, right?
So
Or-
what are the parameter for a border point?
Parameters for a border point is it doesn't meet the minimum neighbors criteria, right? But at the same time, it is in the circle of another core point, right? So this point here, it's in the circle of, it is a neighbor of another core point.
Yeah, I think I understand now. So
Yeah,
it's a core point if the number of points within that circle satisfies the minimum number. So if you have a minimum of 6, then
correct.
does it mean all the points without all the points inside are core points?
No,
Or just the
not all the points, just that point,
Okay.
right?
So
Not
is
the
it
neighbors.
the most central point? That's the core point?
Yeah, the
So
center.
Okay.
see, and why does let me do this. Why does the center even matter? Okay, because you're trying to label or you're trying to identify or classify each point, right? That's what the model is trying to do.
Yeah.
So it first we are trying to draw for this point. Next, we'll try to draw for this point, right? Then we'll try to draw for this point. So like that, for every point, we will draw a circle with the radius of 2. We will draw a 2-sized circle, right? And then what we do is, once we keep drawing these circles, we'll check how many neighbors it has, right? So this one has like about 7 neighbors. So it's a core point, right? The next one, right? The next one, which is this point, right? It has like 4 or 5 points, right? So that point is not satisfying the minimum number of neighbors condition, which means it's not a core point. I'm talking about this point here, right? So this becomes a border point. Okay, because it's not satisfying the minimum number of neighbors condition, but it is a neighbor, or it is present in the circle of another core point. Now this point I marked as core, right, initially. Make sense, guys, now?
Sadwick, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay, so based on that principle of the number of points meeting the minimum of 6.
Yeah.
Now, within that same circle, let's say that we remove 3 points. Okay.
3 points.
We remove
Okay.
3 points out of that circle, and we have 5, including, yes, go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
One more. Yeah. Okay. So we have 5 solid points, and then the circle is crossing one circle. How is this a core point?
Okay. This is not, now it is not a core point.
Why not?
Because how many neighbors does it have inside this particular circle?
You have 5 and it's crossing 1.
Correct, right? But what's the minimum criteria that I'm looking at? Number 6, right?
6, yes.
6 points. So it doesn't have 6 points in its neighborhood. So this can't be a core point any longer, right? Now, if I just, oops.
So quick statement. So in that principle, if the circle is crossing a point, we should totally disregard that.
Right. So the thing is, if it is on the point, you can consider it to be in the neighborhood. Okay. That should be fine. But again, how many points are on the circle? Now, in this case, even if you consider the point, see here, I drew the points to be pretty large, right? In reality, a point is just a speck, right? Just so that we are able to see, I drew the points like that, right? But ideally, like how would the points look like? Points would typically look like this. Okay. Now, do you think that the circle might possibly cut through them? No, right? It might happen. It's not impossible. It might happen, in which case you can assume that the points are in the neighborhood and you can count them in as neighbors, right? But it's up to you. It's up to your discretion. The model, I think, usually basically assumes that if they are on the circle as well, it assumes that they are in the neighborhood, right? But in this case, so assume that in this case, even if it's cutting that point over there, so let's assume 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and let's say 6, right? If we assume that this point is also counted, and if it is, if it's the 6th point, it's meeting our minimum criteria, and in that case, it is a core point. Yes, did that clear your question?
Yes, it makes sense. I just wanted to understand the exception.
Yep.
To the rule.
So that's that's for the first point, right? Now, it's not that the circles will overlap each other. You have only one circle at a point at a time, right? So like, if you guys remember the k-means thing, right? We had iterations, right? In one iteration, in each iteration, we pick a new point, we assign it to some cluster, and then we move on, right? It's the same concept here as well. In the first iteration, I mark this point as either border, core, or noise, right? And then what I do is I get rid of that circle. Now I know that that's a core point or border point, right? Then I move that circle to another point. I put it around this point, okay? Now, so if that's my point, right? You understand now which point I'm referring to, right? The point at the center, right? So if that's my point, how many neighbors does it have? Guys, how many neighbors does it have?
Where's the point?
This yellow here.
Okay, it only has one.
With the red circle around it.
One neighbor.
maybe two neighbors, right?
Yeah, maybe two neighbors. Yeah.
Maybe two neighbors, right?
Mhm.
Now 2 doesn't satisfy my condition here, right?
No. Mhm.
And is this a neighbor to another core point
It
or a
depends.
border point or even a border point? No, right?
No, but it depends. Assuming we have another circle around here, it could be.
Yes, but if you see, it's a neighbor. Its neighbors are this point and this point. And if you put
Okay.
circles around them as well, right? You don't, so this point is also not a border point. This is also not a border point. So, and this point is also not a neighbor of another border point or core point. It's pretty far from all the main stuff, right? That makes this a noise. Okay.
Okay.
Right. So let me give you another example. Okay, let me pick this particular point. Okay. Now let's assume it has five points, right? 5 neighbors, right? 5, which means it is not satisfying our condition, but let's pick this particular point, right? Now this point here, right? Okay, let me use a different color. This purple point here, right? Is that a core point or a border point? Guys, this purple point here, is that a core or border?
It's a border
Why do you say it's border?
because it's not a core. It doesn't have.
How does
Don't
the
think it's a
model?
border
it's
point.
6.
It's a core.
It's a core point because it has
Yes.
6.
Exactly, right? It's a core point because with the circle around it. So don't look at other circles, okay? Border point doesn't mean that a point which is on the edge of the circle. No, that's not the idea here, right? These circles are drawn just to show you the neighborhood, right? Just to give you an idea of neighborhood. In reality, do you think that the model is actually going to draw a circle and check whether the point is falling on the border or not? No, right?
No.
It's just going to look, it's going to look in the vicinity, right? The circle is just to tell it how far it should look in each direction. Make sense, guys, now?
Yep.
Right? So with respect to this particular purple point and the circle around it, it has 6 points or more around its neighborhood, right? And so it is a core point. And one of the points is this. Let me draw the brown point. This point, right? This brown point. Okay. Oh, brown is not visible. Let me draw orange. Okay. It's that orange point, right? One of the neighbors of this point is the orange point, right? Now, so this orange point here has only 5 neighbors in its circle, which means it is not satisfying the minimum neighbors condition. So it's not a core point, but it is a neighbor of a core point, which is the purple point, right? So what does that make the orange point? It makes it a border point, correct? Now do you understand?
Yeah, to some extent.
Again, to some extent.
No, I understand. My question is,
Yes.
everything will have their own circle though.
Yep. Yes.
Every single
Every
dot
point,
that we're
yes.
looking at will have their own circle.
Yeah,
And
they'll
it
have
just
their own
depends-
neighborhood.
Gotcha. And it
Right.
just depends on whichever circle you're looking at to
Correct.
determine if it's a border point or a core point or a whatever it is.
Correct. But then again, see, think of, so it's not, okay, let's say, okay, this point, just because it's the center. So every point, when you're talking about these circles, right? Because it's at the center of the circle, it's not a core point, or because it's lying on the edge of, so let's say, for example, right? What I'm trying to say here is, you see this orange point, right?
Mhm.
Now, with respect to the purple point, this orange point is not the border point.
Right.
And when you say, okay, when you look at the other circle, right, you are not saying that, oh, this is a core point because it's the center of the circle. That's not the concept here.
Right.
Okay. The concept is these circles are just drawn to show, to visualize to you guys what a neighborhood means. Okay. In reality, no circles are drawn. These are not the borders that are being checked. I'll tell you exactly what I mean. Okay. Now, if you see this, right? If you see this, can you all tell me, can you all tell me where the core, the density of the structure is? Where there's more density of the circle, of the points?
Right in the middle.
Right in the middle, right? This one right here, right?
Mhm.
Now, if you see these points all around, right? Okay, let me mark them in a different color. Oh. Let me do this. Get these points. That's right in the right dead center. Okay. Now, let's talk about these points with the green dots in them. Okay. Now, what do these points with the green dots in them look like? Don't they look like the border of the center of the core where there's too much density?
Mhm.
Right? Now you guys understand, right? These points right in the dead center within the red circle that I draw, they will become core points because they are very tightly packed to each other. And most of them will satisfy this condition, right? That they will have at least 6 points around a circle of say 2 units when I draw, right? Most of these points will have at least 6 neighbors around them. The border points may not have 6 points around them, but they are in the vicinity of core points. And so they become the border points. They are still what you call as the outer edge of a dense packing, right? And all the other points, right? Okay. The dark green, all these outer points, right? Now you see these points, right? They're too far away from the real density, right? That's what you call as noise. Makes sense?
Mhm.
No? And that's what you're trying to achieve by drawing these circles. Okay. So with that in mind, for this purple point will be a core, what do you call it? Will be a core point because it satisfies the condition of having at least 6 neighbors in a circle of radius 2 around it, right? The other orange point, it has less than 6 number of neighbors in a circle of radius 2 around it, but it is a neighbor. It is in the neighborhood of a point which is marked as a core point. Okay. And that makes it a border point because it's closer to the core point, right? Makes sense now?
Makes
still-
sense to me.
Okay, cool. Anybody else has any other question?
Yeah, so if you call those ones noise,
Mhm.
they are not, it's not like they are, well, you can still draw another circle to get them into like a border point, right?
Okay, that's a good question. So you mean to say that, okay, I will draw a circle around this point as well.
Mm-hmm.
You will draw, and that's how they are identified as noise. So you draw a circle around every point. You don't leave any
okay.
point, right? But
Mhm.
when I draw a circle around this point as well, and that's how I mark it as a noise in the first place, right? So I draw a circle around this point, but I don't have the minimum number of points, minimum number of neighbors, which is 6. I don't have 6 neighbors. This point doesn't have 6 neighbors, right? Let's call this point A, okay? Now A doesn't have 6 neighbors. And is A a neighbor of a border point? No, right? It's not a neighbor of a, let's say this point, right? Is it a border point? No, because it's not a neighbor. It's in turn, it is not a neighbor of a core point, right? A border point is a neighbor of core point. A noise point is a neighbor of nothing, right? Basically, it doesn't satisfy both conditions, which is minimum number of neighbors and being in the vicinity of a core point or a border point. Make sense? I think you guys, you'll get this into your head once you start reading up about it. Okay.
Makes sense.
All right. So, and that's how the thing, basically the DB scan works, right? For every point, things are checked. Now, if you have to think about, you know, the application standpoint, right? Like if you have to visualize something. Now, think about this as a city, and these are like houses in a city, right? So if you have to classify a specific area as highly populated, or if you have to classify a specific area as, you know, a community or something like that, think of this as like my downtown area or something like that, where there is like too dense, a lot of density in terms of like the buildings and infrastructure that's there, the red circle. The border is basically the edge of the city. And whatever you see, the noise that you see all around is basically the outskirts, the suburbans, or like the outskirts where there are, or the remote areas where there are fewer houses or fewer man-made structures or constructions, right? They're all scattered around. Okay. Make sense? Can you guys visualize that?
So DB scan like draws a bunch of circles to determine which ones are the core and border points and the noise.
Correct.
You
Correct.
know.
And the core and noise, core and border is what makes up a cluster. That's what it determines as, hey, this is one cluster. This is another core, another border, this is another cluster. This is another core, this is another border, this is another cluster. So there are 3 clusters, and the rest of the points which are not belonging to them, which are scattered here and there with a lot of white space around them. No neighborhood, not too many neighbors, not close to any cluster. That's noise. Those are my anomalies. Make sense, guys?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, makes sense.
Cool, awesome. All right, so in last class, I was mentioning about like how do you measure the accuracy of a DB scan. Silhouette score is one metric, as I kind of mentioned, right? Like silhouette score, even elbow method, you could use elbow method as well. It's the same as k-means, but and it works because it's basically looking at the packing of the cluster itself. Both the methods, right? Elbow method and silhouette score, both of them basically calculate the distance between points in a cluster, right? So if your DB scan returns, say, 5 clusters and it's wrong, the silhouette score is going to be bad for that. If it returns 3 clusters, the silhouette score is going to be like, you know, better for that maybe, or maybe worse or whatever, right? That kind of tells you what is the optimal number of clusters. So in case of DB scan, you don't vary the value k, right? For k-means, it was pretty straightforward. You worked with k, you said 2 to 10, 2 to 11 or 2 to 10. You iterated between various number of clusters and you looked at the silhouette score. Here, what you do is you vary these 2 parameters. You vary number of points in the neighborhood and the size of the circle, right? Now, in this case, right, I drew a circle. This size of the circle was, what was the size of my circle? This circle? 2, right? Number 2. So let's say what if the circle was bigger, say 3. Now, if I put this big circle around, what am I going to achieve, right? So if you see, a lot more points will be added to the cluster, right? The smaller the circle, the more close the points are expected to be, right? The bigger your circle, the more points you can add to your core or add to your cluster, right? Even such a, you know, basically such a distribution can also have, let's say if it's a big circle, right? You will probably add a lot more points. If it's a tiny circle, then a lot of points will not meet your criteria. You can vary this as well. You can say 2 points or 3 points or whatever, right? So based on how you vary these two parameters, you can create smaller circles and have lesser number of neighbors. You can say only 1 neighbor is needed, or you can create a big circle and say 10 neighbors are needed, right? Because I'm having a big circle. So you can vary both these parameters, the number of neighbors, the number of points, the size of the circle. And based on that, you build your clusters, right? And that is where the difference comes. When you vary these two parameters, you might end up with 3 clusters, 4 clusters, 5 clusters, 6 clusters, depending upon what you set up as the number of neighbors and the size of the circle. You might end up with different number of clusters. And that's how your Silhouette score will also keep changing, right? And as and when your Silhouette score changes, you keep a track of it. And wherever it peaks, if it's Silhouette score, wherever it peaks, that's your optimal number of clusters. If it's elbow method, wherever it bottoms out, the tip of the bottoming out aspect, that becomes the number of optimal clusters. So far, what we studied in unsupervised learning, at least the first half of this class, couple of classes before, k-means, dbScan, these are clustering methods under the unsupervised learning, right? What does that mean? Basically, what do you do in clustering? Can anyone tell me? What's the goal? What are you trying to do?
Trying to group like data together.
Yep. So you're basically trying to, understand the underlying structure of your data, group them, group similar points or similar observations together so that you can apply similar inferences to that group of people or observations or whatever, right? That's what you're trying to do with clustering. Now, there's the other type of unsupervised learning technique, which is called as dimensionality reduction. Okay, so and that's what we're going to discuss about today, and that's what principal component analysis is all about. Okay, just give me 1 second. All right, so let me quickly share my screen. Yeah. So let's say you have a table, your data, right? And you have right. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, let's say. Okay. And so you have about 9 columns in this data set, right? So what do you get when you do a correlation plot? So by the way, why do you do a correlation plot? You guys remember correlation plot, right? Correlation matrix from DS2. Can anyone explain?
Yeah.
When you look at how different columns are related to each other.
Yep. That's what correlation plot or correlation matrix basically is, right? And why do you do that? Any guesses? Why do you do that, guys? Why do you draw a correlation plot?
Is it not to determine which ones, which columns will be able to fit into the model? Something like that.
Yeah, so that is correct, Jude. So which features or which columns should be considered for modeling purpose and which ones should be left out? Which of the columns are derived versus which ones are independent of each other, right? Now, why is this important? So let me tell you that. Tell you guys that. So let's say we are trying to predict let's take that example of the shirt, right? The price of shirt using a couple of components, right? We use the cost of cotton, we use cost of labor, and then we use cost of equipment, right? So these are three components: cost of cotton, cost of labor, cost of equipment, as three predictors for the price of my shirt, right? Now, does cost of cotton depend upon the cost of labor? Think about it and answer. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
So it does?
Yep.
Okay,
Cost
why
of-
do you think?
Wait, cost of labor will
Yes.
affect cost of cost.
Cost of cotton, right? The cotton, the material that you're buying to
Okay.
sew your shirt, right?
Oh no, it won't affect it.
Right? What do you guys, other guys think? What do others think? Cost of cotton and cost of labor, are they related? Do you think that if the price of tomorrow, if the price of cotton goes up, immediately the laborers will demand more money?
No,
No, right? So they're not related in any way. Exactly. So
they
It'll be
can't
fun.
be related in Africa because anything that goes up, everything goes up in Africa.
so well, that's a see, that's very situational. And see, that is something as called as spurious correlation. Okay, there might not be a direct link between both of them, right? It's not mandatory that one is linked to the other. It's just that people are basing their perception off of the, other aspect. But usually that's not how things work. So this is something called a spurious correlation. Read up about it. It's pretty fun. Okay, so cost of cotton, let's assume this is cost of cotton, right? This is cost of labor. Okay, let's see. Cotton, labor, and equipment. Okay, now do you think that labor and equipment are related? What do you guys think?
Labor and equipment, I don't think so.
What do you think, David, Jude, Eves? What do you guys think?
So which one? Labor and equipment?
Labor and equipment, yes.
They're not related.
Not related? Eves?
Mm-mm. They are not.
Okay. Maybe they are related.
However, maybe
Why?
if it's specific equipment that only some people can operate, yes.
Mhm. Okay, that's a good justification. What's another justification? The more expensive your equipment, right, the less your people might have to do, right? Which means that, let's say it's a machine that takes in the cotton and just gives out a shirt. You'll probably need only one person to monitor it, right? You don't have too many people who are looking at things if it's a machine that's doing everything by itself. But if it's a machine that's only filtering your cotton, right, you still need labor to sew the cotton into a shirt, right? So depending upon how expensive the machinery is and what parts of your operation it is taking care of, right, your labor and equipment cost might be related, but again, not as strongly, right? It's weakly related, but it might be related, right? So the coefficient of correlation, right, it ranges from -1 to 0 to +1, right? So -1 to 0 basically means that it's negative correlation, right? Which means that if one thing goes up, the other goes down. So for example, let's assume for a moment that labor and equipment, right, are slightly correlated, right? Which means that if I buy equipment which is much more expensive, right? If I'm putting a lot of money on my equipment, I'm buying much more expensive equipment, which is taking care of some other of the operations. I can fire some labor, right? And instead get that work done by my advanced sophisticated machinery, right? So what happened here? My cost of equipment went up and my cost of labor went down, right? Or let's assume that I had very sophisticated equipment, but I thought, okay, let me get rid of it and buy simpler equipment, right? But now I need more people, right? In order to take care of the things that the machine is not doing, right? The machines might not do, right? I gave up the sophisticated equipment. So cost of equipment went down, cost of labor went up, right? So do you see the idea, right? Like one thing goes down, the other thing goes up. Now, if this is the case, if they were related, if labor and equipment cost are related, and if one thing goes up and the other thing goes down, it's negative correlation, right? They are inversely proportional. If you guys remember proportionality, we call them as inversely proportional or negative correlation, right? One thing goes up, the other goes down. So that will give you a coefficient somewhere between 0 and -1. It will be a negative value, right? Now, what is positive correlation? If one thing goes up, the other also goes up, right? Let's say, for example, the type of cotton, right? Let's say I am using high grade cotton, right? And only high grade machinery or equipment can process that cotton, right? Appropriately, right? If it's if I put high grade cotton in cheaper machines, right? They might actually be tearing that cotton away or not. They're not able to process that high grade cotton appropriately, right? So the high grade cotton is more expensive. Low grade cotton is not expensive. Low grade cotton, if I put it in a highly sophisticated machinery, right? The machinery might not work well with it because of the impurities in the cotton, like the seeds being left out, not being bleached, or all this kind of various aspects of the low grade cotton, right? Let's say high grade cotton requires sophisticated equipment to process. Low grade cotton can work on lower grade machinery. Neither of them can fit the lower category, right? High grade can't be processed on low equipment. Low grade cotton can't be processed on sophisticated or high grade equipment, right? In that case, if the cost of cotton goes up, if I am, instead of using cheaper cotton, I'm using higher priced cotton, right? The price of my equipment also goes up, right? Or if I'm using low grade cotton or cheaper cotton, I should use a cheaper equipment to process it, right? Now, this is positive correlation, right? So the value of your correlation coefficient will be between 0 and +1 in that case. You guys are understanding? Both increasing. So one variable increases, the other also increases simultaneously. That means that both of them are positively correlated, or both one decreases, the other decreases, both are positively correlated. If one decreases, the other increases. If one increases, the other decreases, right? The opposite is happening, then it is negative correlation. Clear, guys? Understood?
Mhm.
Now, when do you say there is no correlation?
When increase or decrease of one element does not affect the other one.
Absolutely. That's perfect. That's a perfect answer, Liz. So, and that's what exactly happens with cotton and labor, right? Increase or a rise in price of my cotton doesn't affect my labor cost, or decrease in price of cotton doesn't affect my labor cost, right? So if we plot, based on the assumptions that we just discussed, right? If we plot our correlation matrix, right? How does it look like? First one is cotton. So this one will have red color. Let's say one is red, this is white, right? And this is blue, right? And the numbers basically tell me that, so from white to red, the more red the color is, the higher the number, okay? The more blue the color is, the lower the number, Okay, so this one will be red, this will be red, and this will be red. Why? Because a variable is always perfectly positively correlated with itself, right? Obviously, if I'm considering cotton and if I have another column of cotton besides it, right? If price of my cotton for 1 pound is $2, the second column will also have 2 units in that row, right? Second day, if price of cotton has gone to 3, it's the same column, right? Same value. So 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 5, 6, 6, right? Or 1, 1, 0.5, 0.5. So it'll either decrease and increase the same with exactly the same magnitude as well. And the same with labor, right? Let's say cost of my labor is $5 today, tomorrow it's $10. If I have another column of labor besides it, it'll be the same value, right? So every column is perfectly positively correlated with itself. So all this, the diagonal, right? 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3 will always be red, which is perfect positive correlation. Now, but 1 in correlation with 2, right? Cotton in correlation with labor. What did we think of? It has no correlation, which means 1 with 2 will probably be white. 1 with 2 will probably be white, right? And 1 with 3, cotton and equipment, this will be closer to red. Close to red. Might not be perfectly red, but close to red. Okay. And what do you think this other thing will be? 2 and 3, that is labor and equipment. What did you discuss? Just now, what did we discuss? What's the relationship that we assumed that labor and equipment have? Sorry?
I'm gonna say negative or positive. I don't remember.
Don't
So
remember.
did we say it could be related?
It could
Yeah.
be related, so it's a
Yeah.
positive, right?
Yeah, assuming they could be related. What did we discuss? If I buy higher priced equipment, what happens to my labor cost?
It goes down.
Goes down.
Right. But if I buy cheaper equipment, my cost of equipment goes down. What happens to my labor cost?
Goes down.
So what correlation is it?
Red,
Okay.
close to red.
Oh, okay. I guess we're using colors.
Why? Why will it be close to red?
Because the 2 and 2 correlate to each other because it's the same column. So,
Yeah, 2 and 2, but here we're talking about 2 and 3, right?
know,
Labor
yeah,
and
so-
equipment.
yeah, so I'm assuming red means closest or, directly correlated to each other. So if
Positively correlated.
yeah, positively.
Positive and negative. Is this positive correlation although? Because cost of equipment goes up, labor cost goes down. What is positive correlation? Cost goes up, labor cost goes up, cotton cost goes up, or cotton cost goes up, equipment cost goes up. Cotton cost goes down, equipment cost also goes down. That is positive correlation.
Okay, so it's
Right.
negative.
Exactly. So this will be close to blue.
I didn't know it was a blue.
Right? Yeah, because it's blue. I wrote here, right? So the -1 will be blue color. So when you draw the correlation plot as well, this is the color scheme that you will have by default. I don't know if you guys remember that from DS2, but on the right side, you will see -1, 0, and 1. So closest to +1, the color will be red, completely red. The middle will be white, and the bottom will be completely blue, right? So these are the colors that you will get when you do a correlation plot. Now, why did I explain correlation plot so much to you guys? So if you guys remember, with this correlation plot, you can identify which columns might seem related, right? Now, if you see very strong correlation between 2 points, right, then one or the other of those columns might be derived or might be influenced by the other, right? In which case, right, in this case, the correlation might not be too strong, but let's assume that it is too strong. What do? You keep one of the variables and you throw away the other one, right? You do not keep highly correlated variables as your predictors, 2 highly correlated variables as your predictors. Why do you do that? Because each of these variables have a specific effect on your target, right? And what's my target in this case? Price of shirt, right? So let's say, for example, let us look at the labor and equipment cost, and let's assume for a moment that they are very highly negatively correlated. Okay. So if it is very highly correlated, and if I'm using either labor, so let's assume it's to the extent that, you know, I have one of them as a major cost. That's it, right? I either have advanced equipment, which is just sewing my shirt, and I have very less labor, or I have a lot of labor who are sewing, cleaning the cotton, doing everything by themselves, and I have very minimum equipment, right? These are the 2 possible scenarios, let's assume, right? Now, in effect, so what is really affecting the price of my shirt at the end of the day, right? Cotton, yes, that is a factor that will affect my price of shirt. Then if these are the 2 scenarios that I have posed, right? Cost of either I have high equipment cost or high labor cost. Only one of them contributes to the price of my shirt, not both, right? Because if my labor cost is pretty high, my equipment cost is pretty low, and so it doesn't really contribute to my price of shirt. If my equipment cost is pretty high and my labor cost is pretty low, then the cost of equipment that I will take into consideration to price my shirt. Making sense, folks? Right? So it's effect of only one, you know, if they are derived variables, if they are very closely related to each other, right? If one variable is derived of the other, if you put both of these correlated variables as predictors in your model, you are doubling the effect, right? You're doubling their effect in terms of the influence they have on the target, right? So you read up about this, we'll discuss about in the next class as well, like why this happens, like what's doubling of effect, right? Double effect. It's a redundancy in data. It's almost like using the labor column twice, or it's almost like using these 2 columns twice, right? So you don't account for a double effect, right? You account for a single effect of a specific variable. So that's why you draw the correlation plot. And what you do with the correlation plot is you try to figure out whether there are any correlations or associations between multiple columns. And you try to only keep independent columns as predictors in your model. You throw out the derived columns. You throw out the columns which are highly correlated to each other, because you want to have a single effect or an independent effect on your target variable from a specific source. There are, let's say, 3 different sources or 3 different influences on a target variable. You want to just keep 3 different unique sources rather than having 4 sources where 2 of the sources are duplicating a specific effect on the target, right? And that's why you use this model. And it's a feature selection technique. Correlation matrix is a feature selection technique where you try to throw away those columns which are highly correlated, right? Now, this is where it gets interesting. If you have, like here, I was taking the example with 3 columns, okay? So I draw a correlation plot and it gives me a 3 by 3 matrix, right? Now, what if I have 9 columns? How many, what will my correlation matrix look like? It will be a 9 by 9 matrix, right? Now, okay, that's still probably not that bad, right? Like 9 by 9 basically means that you have 81 cells to look at, but maybe that's not bad. What if you have 90 columns and you draw a correlation plot? Can you really select features from a 90 by 90 matrix by looking at the tiny pixels, like these blocks, right, that you see, this red, white, close to blue, these colors, you are able to like visually see these colors and like pick out the features because these blocks are big. Now, if it's 90 by 90 matrix, right, it's probably, there are going to be 8100 cells in that matrix, right? So each of them will be a very tiny box, right? So there'll be like so many lines like this, right? There is like 90 columns in this, and 90 rows in this, right? So each block will be very tiny cell. So you can't really, with the naked eye, right? Like when you build this correlation plot, you really can't, with the naked eye, identify, okay, this column should be there, this shouldn't be there. Like it's impossible for you to process the entire matrix in a manual way and then decide what features should be there and what features shouldn't be there. And this is where principal component analysis comes into picture. And that's why it's an extremely important technique. I want you guys to like really pay attention. We will discuss this in the next class as well. We will do a review of it. So don't worry, but pay attention. So, right. So what exactly happens with principal component analysis? There are a bunch of steps that principal component analysis does, right? So first it standardizes your values because the model is sensitive to variations. Then it looks at picking up, you know, what do you call, it looks at decomposing these columns with eigenvectors and eigenvalues, and there are like, you know, bunch of steps. And then from these decomposed eigenvectors and eigenvalues, it comes up with what are called as principal components. Then it redoes those particular columns, those principal components. It repurposes the data so that it's plotted with respect to these principal components. Okay. Now, what we mean by all of this is, so for a moment, forget about the standardization part. Standardization basically means that you condense your values to a range of like -1 to 1 or 0 to 1, right? You equalize all your values of each column, right? You push those values into a 0 and 1 range. Z-score, if you guys remember that, right? Normalization, standardization, that's exactly what it is. So let's say first column, right? Let's assume that again, this is cost of cotton, right? And per pound, right? Cost of cotton per pound. The lowest cost of cotton per pound was 0.9. Let's assume. What was the highest? Let's say it went up to $18 at one point of time, right? Let's say if this is my range, right? And every column will have a specific range of values that it takes based on the data that you have. You can calculate the minimum value that is there in that column, the maximum value that's there in that column, right? Now, this is one range. Now, cost of labor, let's assume, right? Or cost of equipment. Let's take cost of equipment, right? Cost of equipment might start at $10,000 and might go all the way up to $1 million, right? Now that's a big range, and these numbers are no way comparable to these numbers, right? So this is where standardization comes into play. This value, you will condense all of these values and try to represent them between 0 to 1. And the same is what you will do with this, right? You will condense them and put them between 0 to 1. That's what is standardization. Okay. It's just a transformation that you do so that your model applies things better and it's not thrown off by high variance, right? So for a moment, put that aside. That's a processing step. That's not really the core or the core idea of it. Now, what are principal components? This is what is important, right? It's a condensation of information, right? In order to generate a new sort of like a new variable that governs your target variable, right? So, and what exactly is it? So let's assume that we are trying to, or the model is basically working, we are applying PCA, and these 9 features that we have, right? These 9 features will be condensed into 3 principal components. Components. Okay. So what is each of these principal components? Let's assume again, right? That 1, 2, 3 here, my first PC or principal component is the set of features, the combination of my first 3 columns. Second PC or second principal component is a combination of 4, 5, 6 columns. And the third PC, or the principal component, is, sorry?
I have a question. You say
Yes.
it's a combination of the first three features. How do we know their features if it's unsupervised learning? You know,
How do we know it's?
like they're not labeled.
These are all predictors, right? We are doing this with predictors. We are not doing this with a target in mind. We are reducing the data structure. We are reducing the columns. Understand? So see, these are all my, so that's why this is an unsupervised technique. Do I have the price of shirt here?
No.
No, right? And that's my target variable. I'm not using my price of shirt here. What am I trying to do? I'm using all the columns that I'm trying to predict the price of shirt, and I'm trying to condense them.
Okay, gotcha.
Got it, right?
So if I okay.
The others, did you get Liz's question? It's a very good question. Why am I calling this an unsupervised learning model while I'm giving you an example of a clear prediction case, right? I'm talking about predicting price of shirt, and I'm talking about all these variables, right? These predictors, right? But I'm telling you that PCA is an unsupervised technique. How is that possible, right? Because while I'm doing PCA, I am not considering the price of shirt. I might have a column with the price of shirt variable, right? But I'm not using that yet. What am I trying to do with principal component analysis? I'm trying to shrink my 9 different predictors into smaller number of predictors. Got the idea, guys? Cool. So how does that happen? So PC, a principal component, is taking into account, it's basically trying to condense the information. It's not trying to, like, see, when you do this, right, when you do a correlation matrix and you eliminate features, you'll say that, okay, this is important, this is independent, this is independent. I'll keep these two, I'll remove the third. When you remove a feature, you're losing information, right? You're losing a predictor which has certain influence on your target variable. And what does that do when you lose information? It will bring down your model accuracy. You might not have an important component that tells you what your price of shirt could be, right?
Okay.
You're getting rid of it. You're getting rid of the information, right? Now, when you have 90 different variables, when you have 3, it's one level. But when you have 90 different variables and you want to condense them into, like, say, 6 features, you have to, are you going to throw away 84 features? That's a lot of information to throw away, right? So what principal component analysis does, it doesn't throw away these information necessarily. It looks at which of these variables have high variance, right? The higher the variance, it means that the more it might affect the target variable. That's an assumption that PCA makes. So let's say there is one specific column, column 8, where all the values, right, like over here, are ranging from 0.5 to 0.6, right? Every value is either 0.5 or 0.6, 0.5 or 0.55 or 0.57 or something like that. Everything is between 0.5 and 0.6. Okay. Now that's not a lot of variation, right? There's not a lot of features over there. If you draw a outlier or a box plot, right, you might see a box plot like this, right, where all the values are condensed in a very short region. Now, that means that it might not really have big influence on the price. Now, price is changing, but this value is still always between 0.5 and 0.6, right? So no high variance, which means that it doesn't affect the price. It probably doesn't affect the price. So I might kick out 8. I might kick out the column, the model, right? The PCA. Right now, assume that I am PCA. I am the model PCA, right? I'm the algorithm PCA. So I'm saying that 8, the column 8 doesn't have too much variation. So it doesn't affect my target. So I might remove it. I don't need it, right? And then I take a combination of only 7 and 9 because they still do have some variation and still they might affect my target variable, right? So that's how it works. So it might take a combination of your features. And then it's called a mixture of these features, right? It will take a mixture of these features and then create something called as a principal component, right? Now, let's assume that it creates this particular set of principal components. It's eliminating one column. It's taking 1, 2, 3 as one principal component, 4, 5, 6 as another principal component, and 7 and 9 as a third principal component. Okay. Now, my multi-dimensional data set, right? My 9 features or 9 predictors have been shrunk to 3 principal components, which can be used as predictors. So, right, I have 3 principal components. Now, isn't my model simpler? Right?
Yeah. But
It's
do you
a
have
simpler-
3 columns then, or just, or components are not necessarily columns?
Yes. So components will be taken in as, they are like columns, but it's not interpretable, right? Let's say, for example, what will you define is the combination of my 1, 2, 3 columns, right? How do you define that? They don't have a real life definition. It's just a principal component. You call it as a principal component. It's a mixture. It's the effect of these things put together. You don't have a real life explanation to it. So you have values. You can visualize it as a column, right? It'll have a bunch of values over there, but you can't explain what those values stand for. Making sense, David?
Yeah, I think so.
Right? So when the model generates these 3 principal components, means PC1, PC2, PC3, you can visualize them as columns, but you can't really give them a name. You'll simply say principal component 1, principal component 2. You don't know how to name them, really, right? Let's say you took a demographic data set, right? It might consider age, salary, and location as 3 columns, which are, condensed into one principal component, right? Now, age, salary, and location, the combination of this, what do you name it as, really? Right? How do you define this? Right? So you can't really have a definition to the combination, right? It's just called as a principal component. And this is one sort of slight drawback of using something like PCA, right? Principal component analysis, in the sense that you lose some part of interpretability, which means that now let's assume that I built the model, and then I got high accuracy, like 85% accuracy, and I'm like happy. And I'm like saying that, hey, with this PCA, I have 3 features and I can predict the price of shirt with 85% accuracy, right? But now if my boss, if my manager, or if whoever has asked me to do the analysis, they come to me and they ask me, can you tell me what are those particular factors that are affecting the price of shirt more, right? What are those particular factors or predictors which affect the price of my shirt more? I can't tell them, right? Because all I know is principal component 1 has a higher effect. Let's say that's what my model tells me, right? PC1 has a higher effect on my shirt, but PC1 is a combination, and I don't know how that combination is working. Was it in that combination? Let's say there is cost of labor, cost of cotton, and cost of equipment, right? Now, I don't know which of these is affecting more. It's a combination that is affecting more. I can tell that, but I don't know which of these. Do you guys understanding that? Right? So you lose a little bit of interpretability when you use PCA, but what you gain is a simpler model, a less complex model, which means that you don't need, you don't have 90 features. So when you throw all these 90 features to a model, like a random forest or something, imagine how complex that tree would get, right? You had 4 features in Iris dataset, and you remember how many times it was broken down, right? If you have 90 features, imagine how complex a tree it would be, right? So that's why what you do is you first do PCA, you condense the data set, and then you throw it to the data set, throw it to the model, which will use these principal components as predictors, right? And you will get results, you'll get good results, but you can't explain those results. So you're compromising the interpretability for simplicity. Make sense? Any questions here, guys?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jude.
So why did you remove the 8?
Yes, so I removed 8 because all values in this column 8 are between 0.5 and 0.6, right? And I don't see too much variation as well. It's not like I'm getting values of 0.864 or something like that, right? All the values are like either 0.5 or 0.51 or 0.52, 0.53 and so on. So there are only really 10 unique values, and every value is repeating in those only 10 values, is only taking only those 10 values, right? And the variation in my target variable, the price of shirt, is varying widely. This is not varying too much, right? So if I draw a box plot for column 8, right? A box plot, the column will look like this. The box plot will look like this. It will be a very tiny bar, which means there's not too much variation, right? When I draw a box plot, if my box plot is like this, that means there is a lot of variation, right? The longer the box, the more the variation. The shorter the box, the less the variation or the distribution, right? So principal component analysis believes that if a column has low variation as compared to the variation in the target column, right? It assumes that there is high variability in target column. If there is no high variability in target column, you won't be using ML in the first place, right? Your predictions will be straightforward, right? So it assumes that columns with low variation can be removed because they won't have a big effect on the end result. That's what it assumes. So in this case, my column 8 was an example that I gave to you guys, which has very low variation. And that's why it eliminates column 8. It doesn't even take it into account when it's building its principal components. Jude, did I answer your question?
Yep.
Cool. Now, also, right? So how am I arriving at 1, 2, 3 is my principal component, or 4, 5, 6 is my principal component, right? This is also, even here, right? My PCA model looks at, hey, what are those columns with highest variation, right? So it will take, for this case, right? Let's assume columns 1, 2, 3 have highest variance. It will take the columns with highest variance and build the first component out of that. Then it will take the next couple of columns with like highest variance relatively, and then build the second component, right? And in doing so, what happens is it will have a certain threshold for variance. How much variance should my column have? And all columns which don't have variance beyond that, it will just remove all those columns, right? And it will consider the remaining columns which have like high variance, which means high effect or high influence on my target, and combine them to build what are called as principal components. And then what it does is it finally builds the data set in a 3-dimensional axis or 2-dimensional axis, depending upon these. Each axis is principal component, right? This is where it plots my final data set with the principal component. And then that's how it uses and predicts your data, okay? Now, how does it arrive at these components? How does it arrive at these combinations? That is where eigenvectors and eigenvalues come into picture. That's why we included it in the curriculum in DS2, right? So in DS2, we covered the topic of eigenvalues and eigenvectors, and that's why we did that, right? So that eigen decomposition is what basically happens here, right? That's the process. You don't need to know how it works and all of that. Like, I mean, the details of like how eigenvectors and eigenvalues are calculated, you guys can refer to it, right? And that kind of tells you like how this works, but this is basically how it works, right? It takes in combinations of columns. It leaves out columns with lower variation, picks columns with high variation. The combination of these columns are called as principal components. And that's how it's reducing your high dimensional data into lower dimensions, then repurposes your data in terms of the, repurposes your data in terms of these principal components. And that's what you end up with. That's what you use in your end result, in your supervised model. But the unsupervised technique, the principal component analysis itself, condenses say 9 or 18 or 90 columns into 5 or 6, right? That's where the model stops. Principal components analysis model, the job of that is to construct these principal components, each of which is a combination of columns or combination or condensed information, right? And when it gives you these principal components, its job is done. That is why it is unsupervised model. It doesn't have to deal with the target. So it's not looking at labels. It's just looking at your predictor set. I posted a link on chat before today's class even started, actually. I was trying to look at an article which had like one of the most simplest explanations and the best explanations of PCA. So I stumbled at one article which I felt was like, so he writes in that article right up front saying that I am not going to talk about the math of this, of how PCA works. So he doesn't talk about eigenvalue decomposition. He doesn't talk about what eigenvalues are, how it's calculated and stuff. He's in simple, plain English, he tries to explain what exactly PCA is and how it works. So I found that article is one of the best explanations in a simpler fashion. There are a lot of PCA articles I've read, but they don't have an explanation that simple, right? Because all of them go into the math of things. And it's very difficult to follow those kind of things with the amount of math that is required, right? But read that article. I'm pretty sure you guys will grasp some concepts, some of these concepts. In the next class, as we do, we will do a revision of PCA, but read up your PCA notebook, read up the article that I posted, try to understand PCA again. We'll talk about PCA again in the next class. Okay. Sounds good?
Yep.
Fuse
Sounds
is blown.
Good night, everybody.
Fuse is blown.
Question.
Yes.
You don't have a question, Jude.
Go ahead, Jude. If you do have a question, go ahead.
I don't have a question.
You don't have a question. Or are you afraid of Liz?
He just wants to upset me.
Cool. That's the reason why I'm also stopping the class here. I know it's probably a little too much to grasp, but trust me, it gets better. Read the article, read your notes, try to attempt the lab. Come back in next class. We'll revise this concept once again. Try to, like, when you read this, right, try to remember the class, right? Try to remember what we talked in the class, right? It'll all make sense, okay? It's just a combination. It's a combination of multiple columns. You're just trying to reduce 90 columns to 6. So you're taking combinations and then calling them each as a column or a principal component. Okay, make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. And that concludes our last but one class